Summer night, 1919. Brooklyn. Al Capone was 20 years old, newly married with a baby son at home. He was working for Frankie Yale, doing collections, breaking bones when needed, making a name for himself on the streets. Tonight, he had a simple job. Track down a small-time hustler named Tony Perrotta who owed Yale $1,500 in gambling debts. Find him, collect the money, come back. What nobody knew was that this routine collection would end with Capone pulling a trigger for the first time. One bullet, one body, and the beginning of a legend written in blood. This is the story of Al Capone's first murder. The night a Brooklyn street kid became a killer. And why the cops let him walk away. January 17th, 1899. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York, to Italian immigrant parents. His father, Gabriele, was a barber. His mother, Teresa, was a seamstress. They'd come to America in 1893 looking for a better life, settled in the Navy Yard section of Brooklyn, and had 9 children. Al was the 4th. Growing up, Capone showed promise. He was smart in school, quick with numbers, good with his hands. But he had a problem with authority. At 14 years old, he hit a female teacher in the face after she disciplined him, expelled, education over. From there, Al bounced between odd jobs, candy store clerk, bowling alley worker, bookbindery cutter, all legitimate work. But Brooklyn in the 1910s wasn't a place where legitimate work paid enough to matter. The real money was in the streets. By 15, Capone joined his first gang, the Junior 40 Thieves, then the Brooklyn Rippers, learning the basics, petty theft, intimidation, street fights. But these were kid gangs. The real education came when he joined the 5 Points Gang, a powerful Manhattan crew run by an older gangster named Johnny Torrio. Torrio saw something in the thick-necked Brooklyn kid, saw the intelligence behind the muscles, saw potential. In 1917, Torrio introduced Capone to another rising gangster, Francesco Ioele, who changed his name to something more American, more ambitious, Frankie Yale. Yale had just opened a bar in Coney Island called the Harvard Inn. The name was a joke, Yale and Harvard, but the business was serious. It was a dance hall, saloon, and front for every vice you could imagine: gambling, prostitution, bootlegging. Yale needed muscle. Young, hungry, loyal muscle. He hired 18-year-old Al Capone as a bouncer and bartender. The Harvard Inn was where Al Capone learned the game, how to shake down gamblers, how to collect protection money, how to make problems disappear. Yale was his teacher, and Capone was an excellent student, but he was also young, reckless, full of ego. December 1918. Just weeks after his son Sonny was born, Capone was working the door at the Harvard Inn when a beautiful young woman walked in with her brother. Her name was Lena Galluccio. Her brother Frank was a known neighborhood tough. Capone, cocky and probably drunk, made a crude comment to Lena. Something vulgar, something disrespectful. Frank Galluccio heard it. What happened next took 3 seconds. Galluccio pulled a knife and slashed Capone across the left cheek. Once, twice, 3 times. Blood poured down Capone's face, staining his shirt, pooling on the floor. The scars would never fully heal. 3 long marks across his left cheek that people would stare at for the rest of his life. The nickname Scarface would follow him forever, a name he absolutely hated. But here's the thing about that night. Capone didn't retaliate, didn't hunt Galluccio down, didn't even press charges. Because in the world Capone was learning to navigate, retaliation would have started a war, and wars were bad for business. Frankie Yale actually brokered a peace, made Capone apologize, made Galluccio apologize. Both men shook hands and moved on. It was a lesson. Control your ego. Business over pride. Violence only when it serves a purpose. That lesson would stick with Capone for the rest of his career. But lessons are one thing. Instinct is another. And 6 months later, in the summer of 1919, Al Capone's instinct would turn deadly. Summer 1919. Capone was now 20 years old, married to May, living with his infant son in a small Brooklyn apartment. He'd been working for Yale for almost 2 years, earning respect, moving up in the organization. His main job: collections. When someone owed Frankie Yale money and didn't pay, Capone was the one who showed up at their door. Usually, his presence was enough. 6 feet tall, 200 pounds of muscle, with those 3 scars cutting across his face. People paid when they saw him coming. But not always. Tony Parada was a small-time Brooklyn criminal. Low-level hustler, ran card games, bet on horses, borrowed money he couldn't pay back. He'd been gambling at one of Yale's card rooms and had gotten in deep, $1,500 deep. In 1919, that was serious money. More than most people made in a year. Yale sent word. Pay up or there's consequences. Parada ignored it. Yale sent another message. Parada ignored that too. Finally, Yale called in Capone. Find Tony Parada. Get my $1,500. I don't care how. Just get it done. Capone asked around. Parada wasn't hard to find. He was at a neighborhood craps game on a side street in Brooklyn, the kind of illegal game that moved locations every night to avoid police raids. Capone got the address, grabbed his gun, a .38 revolver he'd started carrying for protection, and went to collect. It was late. After midnight, the craps game was in the back room of a closed grocery store. Maybe 15 guys crowded around, betting nickels and dollars, smoke thick in the air, bottles of bootleg whiskey being passed around. Al Capone walked in. The room didn't go quiet. Capone wasn't famous yet, but a few guys recognized him, saw the scars, knew he worked for Yale, went back to their dice. Parada was in the corner, winning. He'd just hit on a roll, maybe $200 in front of him, grinning like he'd just beaten the world. Capone walked up behind him, leaned in close. Tony, we need to talk. Parada looked up, saw Capone, and his grin faded. He knew exactly why Capone was there. I don't have it, Al. You can see I'm trying to win it right here. Give me another week. Capone kept his voice low. Yale doesn't give extensions. You know that. You've had 3 weeks already. I said I'll get it. Just give me time. Time's up, Tony. That's when Parada made his mistake. Maybe it was the booze. Maybe it was pride. Maybe he thought he could talk his way out. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and got loud. You tell Yale I'll pay him when I'm ready. I don't answer to some Brooklyn errand boy. Errand boy. The room went quiet now. Everyone heard it, and everyone knew. You don't disrespect a made guy in public. You don't disrespect Frankie Yale's collector. You don't embarrass a man carrying a gun. Capone's face didn't change. He just stared at Parada. Cold. Calculating. Pick up your money, Tony. Let's go outside and settle this. Parada hesitated. Then, stupidly, reached for the cash on the table. That's when Capone pulled the gun. It happened fast. No warning, no hesitation. Capone aimed at Parada's chest and pulled the trigger. Bang! The shot echoed in the small room. Parada stumbled backward, clutching his chest, eyes wide with shock. He hit the wall and slid down, blood spreading across his shirt. The room erupted, men scrambling, shouting, running for the exits, dice and money scattered across the floor. Capone didn't run. He calmly walked over to Parada's body, reached into his pockets, and pulled out the winnings, around $200. Then he went through Parada's jacket and found another $1,300 in cash. Exactly what Parada owed, minus the $200 he'd just won. Capone took every dollar, $1,500. He counted it right there, standing over the body while the last few gamblers fled into the night. Then he put the gun back in his waistband, walked out the back door, and disappeared into Brooklyn. By morning, Tony Parada's body had been found. Police showed up, took statements, asked questions. But here's the thing about illegal craps games in 1919 Brooklyn. Nobody talks to the police, ever. The cops knew it was a murder. They knew there had been 15 witnesses. But every single person who'd been in that room suddenly had amnesia. I didn't see nothing. I was in the bathroom. It was dark. Couldn't tell who shot him. Within 48 hours, detectives had identified Al Capone as a suspect. They knew he worked for Yale. They knew Parada owed Yale money. They knew Capone had been seen at the craps game. They brought him in for questioning. Capone walked into the police station wearing a clean suit, calm as Sunday morning. He sat down across from 2 detectives and didn't even look nervous. Where were you last night, Al? Home with my wife and son. We have witnesses that say you were at a craps game where Tony Parada was shot. Those witnesses are mistaken. You're saying you weren't there? That's exactly what I'm saying. We know Parada owed Frankie Yale $1,500. Capone smiled, not a big smile, just a slight curl of the lips. I don't know anything about that. I'm just a bartender. The detectives tried for an hour. Capone didn't crack, didn't slip, didn't give them anything. And without witnesses willing to testify, without physical evidence, without anything tying Capone directly to the murder, the police had no case. They let him go. Tony Parada's murder went unsolved. The case file was marked inactive. But everyone on the streets of Brooklyn knew the truth. Al Capone had killed a man for disrespecting Frankie Yale and taken back every dollar owed. The message was clear. Pay your debts, show respect, or end up like Tony Parada. The aftermath. After the Parada killing, things changed for Capone. Frankie Yale was impressed. Capone hadn't panicked, hadn't gotten caught, hadn't caused problems for the organization. He had handled it like a professional. More importantly, Capone had crossed a line. He'd killed. And once you kill the first time, the second time is easier. The third time is routine. But there was a problem. The Parada murder, even though no one would testify, had put police attention on Capone. And around the same time, Capone had gotten into another violent incident, an assault on a member of the Irish White Hand gang that left the man near death. The White Hand gang wanted revenge. They started making threats, looking for Capone on the streets. Frankie Yale made a decision. Brooklyn was getting too hot for his young protege. Time to send Capone somewhere he could work without the spotlight. Yale called in a favor from his old friend Johnny Torrio, who'd moved to Chicago years earlier and was now working for a powerful crime boss named Big Jim Colosimo. The message: I've got a kid, smart, tough, loyal, but he needs to get out of New York for a while. You got work for him? Torrio did. In late 1919, at the age of 20, Al Capone left Brooklyn for Chicago. He brought his wife May, his son Sonny, and a reputation as someone who would pull the trigger when necessary. He started as a bouncer at one of Torrio's brothels. Within a year, he'd become Torrio's right-hand man. Within 5 years, after Big Jim Colosimo was murdered and Torrio retired, Capone would take over the entire Chicago outfit. By 1925, Al Scarface Capone was the most powerful gangster in America, running bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and corruption on a scale that made Frankie Yale's Brooklyn operation look like a lemonade stand. And it all started that night in Brooklyn. One craps game, one disrespectful comment, one trigger pull. Tony Parada became the first name on a list that would grow long over the years. Some say Capone was responsible for over 200 deaths during his reign in Chicago. He was never convicted of a single murder. But that first one, back in Brooklyn when he was 20 years old, that one set the pattern. That one showed Capone something about himself that he'd carry forever. Violence wasn't personal, it was business. And in the business Al Capone was building, death was just another tool. The lesson: here's what people miss about Al Capone's first murder. It wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge, it was calculation. Tony Parada disrespected Frankie Yale in public, in front of 15 witnesses. In the world Capone operated in, that couldn't stand. If Capone had walked away, if he'd let Parada embarrass him and Yale, every other debtor in Brooklyn would think they could do the same. Violence was the message. Blood was the language. And Al Capone spoke it fluently. The cops couldn't touch him because nobody would testify, not out of loyalty, out of fear. Because if you testified against Al Capone, you'd end up like Tony Parada. That's power, not the gun, not the murder. The fear that makes witnesses forget what they saw. And Capone learned that lesson at 20 years old, before Chicago, before the outfit, before he became the most famous gangster in American history. He learned it in a back room in Brooklyn, standing over Tony Parada's body, counting $1,500 in blood-stained cash. They called him Scarface because of the marks on his face. But the real scars were the ones he left on the streets, the bodies, the fear, the silence. Al Capone's first murder was never solved. Tony Parada's killer was never convicted. And Al Capone walked out of that police station in 1919 a free man. He'd kill again and again and again. If this story got you, hit that like button. If you want more untold gangster history, the real stories, the dark stories, the ones that made legends, smash that subscribe button. We're dropping these every day. Drop a comment. Do you think Capone had a choice that night? Could he have handled it differently? Or was Tony Parada's death inevitable the moment he opened his mouth? And turn on notifications. Remember, in Brooklyn, in 1919, respect wasn't negotiable, and Al Capone collected his debts one body at a time.